Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Open Education Café number 7. Today, we are sharing the floor with Javiera Atenas and Jonathan Poritz. And let me tell you a couple of things about them immediately after we share the topic of today. Our Open Education Baton Café of today talks about open education and generative AI. And our title claims careful when crossing. We want to have an open conversation with two great open education researchers, practitioners, experts who are studying also generative AI from the perspective of their scholarship, but also as practitioners in open education. And we want to have an open conversation about what does it mean to deal with generative AI when caring about open education at the same time. We are going to have a first part of the Open Education Café with them answering some questions that me and Andrea Davidson will ask them. And then we will open the floor to all questions from participants. If you have any questions as participant, you feel free to add them in the chat and we will try to address them properly. Just to let you know that this cafe is recorded and that we are going to share the recording on our NOL YouTube channel, NOL for Open, so that everyone can look and listen to this video once published. So as I said, we have Javiera Atenas, a senior lecturer in learning and teaching enhancement at the University of Suffolk in the UK. Welcome, Javiera. Happy to have you.
Thank you, Paola.
And we have also Jonathan Poritz, who is a former professor of mathematics and computer science at Colorado State University Pueblo, and currently works as an open ed gig worker, as he defines himself. And now he lives in Italy, so I'm very happy that he joins also the Open Education Italia community. Nice to have you, Jonathan. Welcome.
Great to be here.
So let's start. We have, let's say, this topic that is at heart for all of us because something is changing in the landscape of open education, and new technologies and new opportunities come in our computers, and we can all decide what to do with them. What we want to share today is some basic knowledge about what it means to work with generative AI, and also which is the relationship that we see or foresee for open education and generative AI addressed together. And so let's start. I would like to ask both of our guests, and you can decide who wants to start first. If you could introduce yourself a bit to tell us briefly, what are you working on now? If there is anything particularly related to the work that you are doing to explore generative AI in relation to open education, and if you are looking at its potentials and risks organically, because we would like you to share some examples and some practices that maybe can be inspiring for our librarians and our practitioners attending this meeting today. So it's up to you. Javiera, if you want to start.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Paola, and thanks for this invitation. I have been lucky enough to be invited by UNESCO, so the UNESCO Aerodynamic Coalition, to help them draft the materials for the Dubai Declaration. So I've been working with them for the last few months. We released the Dubai Declaration in Dubai a few weeks ago. And one of the things I've been working on is to look at open educational resources within the new agenda of digital public goods. And it's not just open educational resources, but it's the entire open ecosystem. So open science, citizen science, open access, open source, and how we can have this new umbrella to help us work together. We have a quite fragmented ecosystem in terms of open education, open educational practices, OER, open science. Each movement is developing their own guidelines, is developing their own good practices, but we don't tend to talk to each other. So we are very open in sharing. We are very close in talking. So this new umbrella, which is basically a term that it's been deployed by the UN, talks about digital public goods. That includes two sets of things. First is public infrastructure, so public digital infrastructures. That includes all the repositories, systems that we use for education, systems that we use for science, so including like open data repositories, open data management systems, but also is to talk about the idea of open solutions rather than OER, open science methodologies, open science standards and principles. So how do we bring standards from wider communities, for example, the ROAMX indicators, into enhancing the governance of OER or open education in terms of mitigating the risks of AI and actually creating green solutions and working with stakeholders in a further, more enhanced governance model, because our governance models are very fragmented. But also, how do we develop infrastructures that are sustainable at the long term in terms of investing in people rather than investing in technologies? Because you should know, it's like we have a large cemetery of policies, a large cemetery of repositories in open education that actually are not up to date and not fit for purpose. So basically, this is what I've been doing for the last few months. Jonathan.
Hi. No, so it's great to be here. Let's see. So I'm as Pablo mentioned. I mean, I have lots of questions for Javiera when we get further. So this is going to be fun. But my background is I'm a mathematician and computer scientist, and I got started in software years ago and learned about the open source FLOSS, free libre open source software world, and I sort of only learned about OER after a while and realized, oh, that's the same thing for educational resources as FLOSS is for the software world. And I guess I've been my involvement in the AI aspect of things is because I love mathematics and computer science, and I like talking about them, and I like teaching, and I figured that I have some expertise and some interest, and it would be a lot of fun to talk to people as this new thing is happening, that people would want to talk to someone who has read all of the computer science papers before they make, laws and policies and university policies and, policy for your classroom and so on. And I've been sort of shocked at how people seem very uninterested actually in talking to people about the technology. I was talking to the in-house counsel for a major open movement NGO, I won't name names, and said I was a little bit appalled by it seemed to me that the US Copyright Office's perspective on generative AI output is kind of nonsense and based on a misunderstanding of what generative AI does and is. And this person said, and I was shocked that the US Copyright Office had no interest, had no interest or access to computer scientists to find out what the technology actually does. And this in-house attorney for a major NGO said to me, oh, I don't think anyone really is going to bother doing that. No one is going to talk to the technical people about this before they make it, because we don't have time. That's not our remit. We're not technologists. We're policymakers or lawyers or politicians. So I guess I have been hoping a lot lately that I could be useful to the community, and by talking about some of what the technology is and what it can do. And I have a very so I'm trying to be active in this way. I'm trying to do some writing and trying to go to lots of meetings and ask lots of questions. And I guess I have to say I start this with a huge sense of pessimism for both the progress of my particular goal in working in being a useful person to talk to about these things, because I actually had a very similar experience during when I don't know if you all remember the blockchain era when everything was all education was going to be on the blockchain and currency was going to be on the blockchain and blockchains were eating the world. And I went to my first Creative Commons Summit in Toronto and met some really interesting people who were talking about how wonderful blockchain was. And I worked as a computer scientist. I actually wrote some papers that got a whole lot of citations out of the blue when Bitcoin started to exist in the world, because my papers were related to the foundations of blockchain. And blockchain kind of blew up, and no one really was interested in talking about the technology. And again, the same thing as I say, I'm trying to do in AI. I thought, oh, gee, I know this stuff really well. Surely people will want to talk about it. And I would go to meetings and say, oh, you propose the following use case of blockchains in education. It doesn't make sense the way you've described it. Let me spend a few minutes to explain, and here's an alternative way to do it, which would be just as much more efficient and have the same useful applications in education. And no one had any interest in talking to me about that. So I'm afraid that the same thing may be happening right now with AI. For example, the EU has the EU AI Act, which I think is a very interesting thing. And there are parts of the EU AI Act which are either they completely don't understand what AI is, or they're playing some very fancy four-dimensional chess, and they're trying to convince the companies to claim to be doing something they're not doing in order to apply regulation in contexts which maybe they would not otherwise have the traction to apply these regulations. Or, I don't know. So I guess so that I just wanted, and I quickly want to mention, just before we jump back to this thing, I think it's interesting. It's really fun well, it's important, I think, for us to think now in open education, what's happening in the world. I mean, I'm a dual US and Italian citizen. I'm now living in Italy and don't plan to ever move back to the US. As I'm sure people are aware, there was an election recently in the United States, and I'm sorry, but fascism is on the rise. I do not know what is going to happen in the United States. And it's for example, I don't think I'm going to be doing open ed gigs for organizations in the United States, which is what has been my income source the last 2 years when I moved to Italy, because I don't think there's going to be funding for that anymore. Most of the gigs I do are from federal funds for open education. I think that's going to dry up. It's a wrestling entertainment industry executive who's being given control of the education department in the United States. And it's not just a sickness in the United States. We have fascist type governments all over the world, in Europe, in other places in the world. And I think it's time for us in open education to think about open education under fascism. That's a thing that we as educators have to think about. And I think we need to think about, and so why is this relevant to AI? Because it's relevant to AI because if you were to guess, here's the question, if you were to guess, what was the industry that contributed the most amount of political contributions in the most recent US presidential election? What would you guess? Something like petroleum, or banking, or healthcare, which is the terrible broken system. All of those famous industries that had famously spent hundreds of millions of dollars on political campaigns, they were not the largest one. The largest industry as an industry funding politics in the United States was the cryptocurrency industry. The blockchain, Bitcoin, those people. And it is the same people who are now running companies in AI. So the head of OpenAI is a former cryptocurrency entrepreneur. So I think we have to, in open education, we have to be thinking about or in education period, we have to be thinking about using technologies which do not increase the power of some, I'm sorry, very bad people. So I have to say I have a huge amount of skepticism about applications of AI in education, because I think, even if there is some small positive benefit, I see like 2 or 3 use cases of a small amount of positive benefit that maybe large statistical models could make in education. I think there's a very high moral barrier I see before we spend our time and money enabling those tiny little positive things to happen, while at the same time giving more power money to some really terrible people. So anyway, that was my perspective. Sorry if I went a bit off-piste.
Don't worry, strong initial point. So it's wonderful to hear from you and to have your perspective in this conversation. Maybe it could be good to take a very small step back and provide our participants with your definition of generative AI. What does it mean to talk about generative and AI in the same acronym? Because maybe this is a good starting point, and then we can move to the next question.
Javiera?
The technical definition is quite clear. It's basically machine that repeats patterns. The problem is that those patterns, and this is where I'm going to go again political and completely agree with him, are racist, sexist, and actually fascist. I agree with you. It's not a sarcastic caricature. It tells you what you want to hear in the way that you want to hear it, but actually it's wiping people out of history. And this is one of the things that we've been doing when I do academic CPD for AI in production of learning and teaching context. It's further removing women from history in learning and teaching. For example, if you don't mind, I will love to show a little set of slides that I have on that, because this is a very simple example that we use. Let me show you here. It basically keeps reiterating and showcasing. Let me see if I can share this one. Basically, the machine, it's been repeating the historical biases and prejudices that we have since we first started recording things as humanity. If we look into how those historical biases are actually being perpetuated and actually amplified with AI, we need to look into, for example, how the first computing systems gathered data from Rockefeller Foundation that was giving money to those organizations, those charity organizations in the US that were helping the poor, deprived, and useless for society. So basically how they were codifying society, but also redlining in terms of mapping spaces, where it was actually mapping of segregation, poverty, impoverishment, and these same biases were incorporated from the first historical social records in the way that we describe people to the first IBM computers, because this is the first elements of welfare. This is what actually you can find. I completely recommend to read Algorithms for Oppression. So we have world data that is extremely prejudiced, extremely right, on the right, like politics. It has historical misrepresentations, temporal biases, omits people from history. Women are already erased. Now we're like basically being like completely wiped out of history. Because this is what these algorithms do: repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat prejudice, racism, and sexism. And then if we don't have human input, that has been years of critical pedagogies, critical reflection, critical theory, philosophy, how are we going to embed, how are we going to challenge those views? So if we look into, for example, and this is a very, very, very simple example. I've asked ChatGPT to do a table with the main theorists and theorists, but also theorists in childhood education. So we have Pavlov, Skinner, Piaget, Vygotsky, Brunner, Bandura, Gardner, and Cole. Even Gardner is not a theorist itself. He's basically snake oil seller, because there's nothing like multiple intelligence and stuff. He's basically someone with enough money to fund himself to become a theorist. He's not. Where is Maria Montessori? Where is Maria Montessori in childhood education? So I've asked Bing to the same question, the copilot. Hey, these are the men, the white men, the white men. So then do a portrait. Okay, do me a portrait. White male. Some have beard, some are not so young, but they're all white. And apparently there is a woman hidden in there. This is what we're doing when we use AI. We are perpetuating systematically the oppression. We are systematic, showcasing biased and not just incomplete, but wrong information. So we will have an entire generation of students, future pedagogists, future teachers, that actually have not seen a woman in pedagogy in their lives. So yeah, this is kind of the main risk, that we're amplifying biases, prejudice, and more. And this is the thing, we don't have at this moment, in for example, critical foundations of pedagogy, we don't have elements dedicated to demystifying history. We don't have teaching on mitigating biases in algorithmic systems. So basically what we have is a big machine now that tell us that everything that we wrote and thought is wrong. We need to follow this new, very, very, very segmented way of thinking, because it's good to erase people from history. So that's my definition.
Thank you, Javiera. Is it time to ask the next question, maybe, Andrea, then?
Yes, yes. I think it's a good seg too from the theorists in pedagogy, and we wanted to talk about the place of open education in higher education with the rapidly changing context that generative AI presents. What is the relationship between open education and generative AI now? What could it be? And how can practitioners get that relationship right in this context?
May I kick off?
Please.
Okay, so open education within the open movements is the most dogmatic movement of all. We are being ruled by a set of imposed rules, principles, the 5 R's, that's actually not being agreed by the community. It's actually been imposed. It's someone from the US imposed those 5 R's. This is open educational resources, and they have to do these 5 things, or they're not open educational resources. Unfortunately, the same group keeps or has changed the discourse in terms of actually 5 R's now. It's open educational resources are dead, and we all have to use AI, and that's it. AI is the future. So we need to stop doing OER. Although, if we look at what open science, which is kind of my other side of the world, and open data, which I work very heavily in that field, are talking about principles, community values, collaborative generated standards, which we don't have. So instead of following the 5 R's, as people in the movement have been following, kind of blinded because it's a mandate, comes from above, from a pater familias, let's say. What we haven't adopted the FAIR principles to index open data, open educational resources. What we are not following, all the models. Actually, FAIR, for me, it's really clear, it's findable. So allows your OERs to be find and retrieved and searched by everyone, should be interoperable. If we look at, and is this kind of if we look into the OER landscape, most of our OER are currently hosted in LibGuides, which is an amazing work that librarians are doing, except when you stop paying the subscription to LibGuides, they're all gone. And LibGuide is not interoperable. It's HTML based, so you basically grab the HTML code, paste it somewhere, edit it, and off you go. But we have better principles, we have better structure, we have better community decision-making processes. In open data, for example, now the questioning is and I just went to the UN Data Forum, is basically all the open data was released way before, because all the mandates on transparency and anti-corruption come before the explosion of AI. So all the open data from governments is not fit for purpose to train algorithms. But now we're being told by these same pater familias that we need to stop doing OER by ourselves, critical OER. We need to stop doing it. We need to let AI do the work for us. But we can see that it's actually very, very, very misleading, because it's being basically omitting, withdrawing, and enhancing prejudice again. So we need to change the switch on the conversation towards how we're going to embrace these open solutions, this better community practices, better governance model, more interoperability formats, having better infrastructures that are co-governed by OER practitioners, and look at what are better ways to adopt community-based and democratic-oriented based approaches to continue with the work with OER that is beyond the 5 Rs. The 5 Rs are not fit for purpose, and it's been imposed on us. I think we need to look at better models. ROMX is really good, but it also includes gender, includes data protection, includes copyright, like valuing copyright and acknowledging copyright way better. But also we need to start thinking about adopting the FAIR principles for data management in OER, because at the end of the day, OER is data. Jonathan.
We have a hand raised by Peter also. Peter, if you want to open your microphone.
I think I had a comment, but I can wait until Jonathan also has had his input to the question by Andrea, if you want.
Sure. Okay. Let's see. So the question was sort of what the role of generative AI in open education and higher education in general. I guess I do see a few use cases for what is currently described as generative AI in higher ed. A really good friend of mine named Alegría Rivadeneira, who is a professor at Colorado State University Pueblo and was one of the OE Global prize winners, award winners a few years ago, has done really interesting things. She uses, I forget one of the tools, to have students sort of, they write essays and they get sort of input from this tool, and she uses it as a tool that, and she very much developed a whole interactive pedagogy with the students doing writing and getting comments from one of these tools, you know, sort of in the vein of having your peer review being done by ChatGPT, which I think is one of the worst ideas I've ever said out loud. But she has figured out a way to do that in the context of education in the classroom that kind of is, she's not taking it as gospel. It's not being used to evaluate the student, but it's used to give a different words around the students' creations that they can respond to, and it's very useful. Other than that, I think there are interesting things. As a community, we value accessibility, we value openness of knowledge, we value justice, as Javiera said, people, women's history and people of color and people in colonialized indigenous people. And so I believe deeply in access, and I think one of the things that these tools can do is, so for example, alt texts. People are always saying, well, there aren't enough alt texts for digital books, and those lazy authors never write them. So we'll just have generative AI produce them. I want to come back to this in a second, but it does a pretty lousy job, and it's not a pedagogue. So it does not understand the purpose of an image in a textbook. It cannot describe the image in a way that matters to the textbook. I've written textbooks where the same image appears in different places for different purposes. And there's no way that some statistical model trained on biased and horrible information on the internet, as Javier pointed out, is going to know how to explain correctly in the right context an image. However, if a lazy author is not giving alt texts, and if a piece of software can give some information that a person who has a visual impairment can take advantage of to get better access to that material, I guess I'm in favor of that. There's also an issue people talk about, machine translation. So there's a very big shot, another paterfamiliaris in the United States who has offered to translate huge quantities of OER into various languages. Many of them are in English, to translate them into languages where communities are having suffered, for example, Ukrainian, where communities are suffering a lot of problems in the world today, and having access to high quality educational materials in their language would be useful, and has taken a large corpus of OER and translated them all with machine translation. I was speaking to a Ukrainian librarian a couple of months ago, and she told me not a single one of those is useful. They cannot be used in the classroom. They just are, the translations, are not of a level that you could put that material in front of a student. I live in a country where my native language is not the language spoken on the street. I use machine translation many times every single day. I have never, ever, ever, for even the shortest sentence that I'm going to send to a friend about where we're going to meet for coffee, taken a machine translation and just stuck it in a text or an email. It's never good enough. It always has to be edited. So maybe it's a starting point for automatic translation. So anyway, those are the use cases I can think of that might be positive. I think the other thing that we in education have to do with generative AI is resist it, right? It's giving power to people with money. It's empowering bias and against, telling the wrong version of history. It's taking all of the worst things that are on the internet and kind of glorifying them, as Javiera pointed out. I think that we, I've had conversations with Paula about how we need to teach our students about generative AI, because they're going to go out in the workplace and they're going to have to use it. And actually, I don't know if I think that's true anymore. I've been speaking to people who work as programmers. A good friend of my son's works for a very large programming firm, and he said they tried generative AI as code generating tools and they gave up on it because it just doesn't work. And so I think that we're going to see very soon that all of these people who want to make more money off us are promising applications, and they're not going to materialize. It's going to dry up and blow away. And so what we might need to do in education is do a better job of teaching what a statistical model is, right? Some of the things that Javiera pointed out about how if you train a large statistical model on bad data like Reddit or 4chan or something, you're going to get garbage coming out, because garbage in, garbage out. And to say that in a more sophisticated way with understanding of what a statistical model is I think the role of education. I will take responsibility. I was a math educator for many years. I think we do a terrible job of teaching people what a statistical model is. I give presentations and I say, oh, generative AI is just statistical models. And people draw back from me in fear because the phrase statistical model is a little scary. And I think we as educators, it's clear that technology is important. This thing is, they're coming for our wallets, they're coming for our politics, they're coming for our vision of history. And we need to teach our students enough, we need to make math and science and computer science education less scary and something that people can come out, everyone should come out of getting a higher education degree anywhere in the world, certainly in Europe, should come out of a degree and not be scared of the phrase statistical model. Well, I know what that is. It's a thing like drawing a line through some data points. It's not a hard thing. I gave a scatter plot to my doctor here in Tuscany, and she drew back from it like I'd put a tarantula on the table in front of her. She was so scared of my scatter plot. And I think we need to teach people not to be scared of this. And so the role of GenAI, in my view, it's a use case that we can talk through to do a better job of education and to have a better understanding, better critical. It's only. Javiera's example of mistelling the history of women in childhood education, theory of childhood education, right? That's actually a useful thing to, not if you're teaching the theory of child education, in which case you should teach Montessori and all those other great people who are not white men. But if, in a larger sense, teaching students, hey, look, the world is filled with mistellings of history because of power and money imbalances. Be aware of that. That's a useful lesson to be drawn. I don't know, anyway. There are several hands up, so maybe we should spread the conversation out a bit.
Let's start with Peter. Peter, please go ahead, and then Marta.
All right. I think I will perhaps be devil's advocate a bit, because I don't very much disagree, but I do think that open education, I guess I think the most promising tool for open education is generative AI, specifically generative. And it's a bit hard to explain why, because it's only a potential presently. It's not the real case. With respect to the bias, I think it's important to remember that because it is a statistical model, that the bias is incidental and not inherent. It's just because it's trained on Reddit. I guess wherever it had been trained, the same bias would have been present, because, for example, in our textbooks on pedagogy, there is Piaget and 4 or 5 others, Vygotsky and that sort of thing, but there are no women names mentioned in at least in the introductory courses. So the same bias would be present there too. And so it's really just I mean, if you understand that it's just sort of perpetuating what is already the dominant trend on the internet, then you also shouldn't blame it for it. You wouldn't want it to be sort of controlled by one faction in any kind of sense either. So it's just it's an open problem. But why I think it has great potential is the primary inequality, I think, is access to dynamic supervision, so that you can get some sort of Socratic dynamic going in your education. Most students don't have a supervisor that they can talk to get answers to their questions. And I feel that, I mean, at present, you can't use the generative AIs to talk to a text properly because the token length isn't there yet. So it will just start talking nonsense quickly. But in principle, it should be possible to have a dialogue with your textbook, which is not something you could have unless you had one-to-one time with your supervisor, which is not, I mean, financially realistic for most universities. So that's where I see the promise. Of course, that is knowing as a user. When I use it, for example, to remind me about symbols in set theory, that was the latest use. I know that if I had asked it about something I knew properly, then I wouldn't have been satisfied with the answers. I have, of course, done that, asked it about things which are my specialty, and then it doesn't reply good enough. But it's still much, much better than having to struggle with it myself alone. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I quickly respond to that, Paolo, before we? I think that thank you so much. I think Peter, I think that's an interesting. Your voice accepting. I've heard a lot of other people say. I think it's important for us to address these things. I actually think there's a lot of things I want to say. So one of the things I want to say is that I have the feeling that in almost 100% of the cases that people talk about, oh, this great thing that's about to happen with generative AI. I'll come back to it in a second to that phrase "about to happen." But if you stop and think for a minute about the great thing, it's kind of dystopian, right? I mean, so for example, you're saying we don't have enough interactive supervision of learners, right? And so let's plug them into a machine. I mean, I don't see, so you're putting your finger on, indeed, a real problem. The class sizes are too large in many public educational systems around the world. The students do better with direct contact with a knowledgeable and experienced teacher. How does connecting them to a chatbot solve that problem? You put your finger on a problem. There's a solution, which is to better fund public education, right? And why are we instead giving huge piles of money to people, in the PayPal mafia and who already have too much money to solve this problem? I agree with you, it's a problem. I don't think this is a good solution. Another thing I want to say was, so you're saying it's more, you think it's the most important thing because it's going to be, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be aggressive here. I think these are really great issues and we need to talk them through. I don't want to be too aggressive, but I think you're saying these are great issues and it's more attractive in the promise than the reality. And I'm a little bit concerned about why does the educational community in the world sort of think that these promises that this particular set of people is offering to us, which some of them I just a minute ago said I think they're actually dystopias if you look at them carefully, but even if you think of them as utopias, why do we believe these particular utopias from these particular people? They're extraordinary claims. The paterfamilias that Javiera was talking about, who believes that in the future we don't need to write any more OER because we'll just be able to type a short prompt into OER GPT and it will spit out a beautiful new textbook. Why does he believe that? What evidence is there? I've written books. Many people in this room have written books. It's not easy, right? It's not something you do quickly. It's building on decades of experience and knowledge. Why do we think that this is going to suddenly happen? We believe these promises. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, a few months ago said he thinks that in a few months, generative AI or artificial general intelligence will help California solve one of its biggest political problems, which is housing for people who don't have a lot of resources, solve the housing crisis in California. Why does anyone think that? You know, the former CEO of Google said he thinks that we don't need to worry about the climate impact of these huge server centers which do the processing for AI, because AI is going to solve the energy crisis and the climate crisis any day now. So let's burn the, let's put enormous quantities of CO2 in the air today, because tomorrow they're going to solve the energy crisis. I mean, when someone makes extraordinary claims, they should first give you some extraordinary proof. Instead we have crappy images of people with 6 fingers and lousy text that every professor who reads it says, oh, come on, do a better job of cheating next time. And that somehow is evidence for these extraordinary claims. As Peter, you were saying, these are great promises. If I believe there was some evidence that these promises were going to be verified, I might open the conversation. But until I see some example of a great innovation coming out of it, I don't see any reason for us to have the conversation or to believe that it's going to change the world. Anyway, I'm sorry. Another person can respond.
Marta, please.
I should unmute myself, shouldn't I? Okay. So from the point of view of a librarian who gets called into the classroom on a regular basis to talk to students about the ethics of AI. And also from the point of view of a librarian who's just contributed to a toolkit in Spanish on open education, right? So I think that the real issue is the same issue that we all have in education, which is to prepare our students to be critical thinkers. And I don't care what you're talking about, if it's AI or if it's anything else, unless you, first of all, get them to think about the implications of those tools and about the quality of the material that gets produced by those tools, then everything else is completely irrelevant. I mean, the problem is, of course, that the tools are so pervasive, everyone can use some form of chatbot, AI chat box now, right? But until I sit them in front of a chatbot that gives them completely invented references for their essay, they're going to think that AI is fantastic. So I think we have to do the work. The work is, yes, AI may be able to help us in open education in some ways. It has already helped me create that Spanish toolkit by giving me a very, very basic version of Spanish that I could then edit and whatever. Fine. So what? The real issue is understand those data sets. Understand that even the people who are working with the algorithms are probably unable to replicate what the algorithms do because of the black box. Understand that there are major biases to all of the data that those tools are working with. You know, like, if we are in open education, then we have to be educators, right?
Can I add to that? And thank you, Marta, just in order to introduce the next question, which is actually so what? Because what Marta mentioned is that we decided on purpose to use different AI, generative AI tools to support the first step of the translation process of our NOL toolkit in its last version, right? So what we did was to start from the basic version that different AI tools provided with all their biases, including the fact that some of them do not include European languages, not all of them, and that the quality response was very different from language to language. So I'm just adding a practical example to what you, Jonathan, and Javiera shared a moment ago. Of course, what we discovered through that process, which was planned since the very beginning, is that the support of our librarians, native speakers of each language, needed to go in depth into the version that we had from any generative AI, whichever the level, because all of them needed our hands on the final version of the translation, okay? So this was our way to critically approach the tools. And I agree with Marta when she says, and now I'm asking you the next question. I agree with Marta when she says, whichever the level of the generative AI proposed solution is now, we continue to be educators, most of all open educators, which means that one level is to deal with the answer that we receive, and also what you said before, which strikes me all the time, this narcissistic approach that AI continues to promote, okay, giving us this wonderful feedback like, oh, this is a very interesting question. I asked you 1 + 1, does it make 2? So, which is interesting in my question. But still, one thing is the answer that generative AI tools give us. Another thing is us as educators telling the cohorts of students, whichever their age, including elderly people, what does it mean to use these tools? How reliable are them? How to critically approach what they give you back when you ask any kind of question. So those are two different areas. So what? Then the next question to you, what do we do now? Which is the role that we can play in a positive way, in an active, proactive way as open educators?
If you don't mind, I like to shoot with a bit of reflection. For many years, educators and students were warned against Wikipedia. Wikipedia was the devil, the evil. It was community-based, it was co-governed, it relied on insights from different members of the community, it was quite democratic, and people questioned it, questioned the methods and their outputs. Nobody is questioning the methods or the outputs of AI. In fact, there is a massive campaign on telling us, embrace it, go, embrace it, hug it, take it home. I agree. AI, it's practical. I've used it to summarize tables because I have big chunks of data. I need to create a table. Help me to create some diagrams because it will take me forever to try to do a decent diagram. Help me to summarize a bunch of text, but I know what I'm reading. I selected those texts. I wrote the text that I need to extract a table from, okay? It's helpful for captioning, to get captioning and automated captioning from videos. Sometimes we have meetings for research. I just put the caption, the text caption, extract the text, summarize it, and then kind of send a summary to the group that we're working with, because normally I wouldn't have to take notes during meetings. It saved me quite a lot of time. In terms of translation, yeah, could be useful, although we need to adopt the Wikimedia style for community-led work. We need to work with students. We need to work with experts. We need to bring back what we've been warned not to use, and actually, which is one of the best open educational practices in terms of not just creating content, because Wikimedia is top-notch in terms of content, although these days the poor editors from Wikimedia are dealing with people just dumping rubbish and garbage from AI-generated content. Actually, they're dealing with the same things that we are dealing, because what it was written by a community, now people is just dumping things from generative AI pages. But it's that kind of collective decision-making processes, which I love from Wikimedia. I teach two things. I love to do two things at the same time. I lead on the academic development program at my university. I'm the course leader for the postgraduate certificate in academic practice, but I also teach data visualization and data analysis and visualization for social scientists. what do I do? Basically, I teach R. I teach how to model data, how to extract data, how to work with social science, like with social science data, and turn some normally understood as qualitative data into numerical data, make statistics, make analysis. I work with undergrads. It's the first introduction to R, sometimes the first introduction to statistics, statistic modeling. And actually, what I've learned from the open data community is like, data can be rough, can be broken, we need to fix it. So we do data expeditions, we code the data, we clean the data, and then we use R to process it, and we do nice data visualizations. What AI can help us on that is basically help us to organize the tables when we have to move between currencies or between languages and formats where it's like no ISO standardized because data comes from different sources. What I do with the postgraduate certificate in academic practice is basically create this sense of, or help them develop this sense of criticality, because they need to learn to assess work that may have been written by AI. If you see the amount of work that us educators are getting that actually are written by AI, and you cannot prove because Turnitin cannot trigger the alert, we need to learn to develop the eye to see patterns, because this is what AI does, reproduce patterns, the way the things are written are very, very kind of same structured sort of sentences. Teach people how to play with it effectively. And some of the work that we've been doing with Chris and Eranzi and that team is actually try to use AI critically and creatively in the classroom. I'm going to share the materials soon. We've written two papers have been published. A third one is coming soon, but it's about critical and creative pedagogy using AI. Students need to learn to understand AI critically. They may or may not use it in the future. Maybe the future will be assess whether someone is been using it. That's what we've been doing. But we need to come back, and this is kind of my very personal, not very humble opinion, because I'm an academic, we don't tend to have very humble opinions. Sorry. It's to bring back the community into into open practices, not just education. We are part of a wider, large movement. We need to work in terms of like bringing the methodologies from citizen science. We need to learn to work with data more effectively. We need to learn how to make decisions through data and assess data effectively from what we've learned from the open data movement. We need to learn how to better govern our processes in terms of openness. And that's what we have learned from the standards and the practices from open government. We need to stop working in isolation and stop listening to this like, oh, let's embrace the new things. Oh, a new thing shining. Oh, that's a new toy. No, we need to be very critical and actually bring community to add value to the processes. And in our community, our stakeholders actually, of course, the library, the librarians, and the students, because they need to learn to develop knowledge, not just regurgitate knowledge in another format, which is basically what in the UK tends to happen with essays. We need to find more effective ways to teach and to co-construct knowledge rather than impart teaching through AI-generated content that might be really, really poor quality. That's it. Enough with my rant.
Well, that's a wonderful practical suggestion, to use AI critically and creatively and to co-create with students. Jonathan.
Yeah, so let's see, I'm trying furiously taking notes. I think, I guess I would say one thing we haven't really much mentioned, but in the vein that Paula was saying, that there's a community of librarians that can be contributing. And one of the things librarians are very good at knowing about is intellectual property and copyright law. And I think it's important that when you as a librarian are working with people in your institution and someone comes in and says, oh, I was thinking of using GenAI to do X or Y or Z. I think librarians have the background and the understanding to be aware of what is happening in this area. What is happening in this area is extremely confusing. I was at a presentation just two days ago, I think, that was saying, oh, it's a chaos, it's a mess. There are cases pending in North America. There are cases pending in some cases have recently been decided in Germany and other European jurisdictions. I think it's important for this to be something people think about. And the thing I think is interesting is that the view that we were given just a few years ago, well, this is happening quickly. I went to lots of presentations because I work with Creative Commons a lot, as Paula pointed out. I went to lots of conversations about copyright law and generative AI outputs, and everyone sort of thought, oh, it's kind of clear what's going to happen with that. And everyone would tell me, and I said, I don't think that makes sense from a sort of details of the law or the idea, the letter, or the philosophy of the law. And people would say, oh, you don't understand, you're not a lawyer. And I think at the last couple of presentations I've gone to, there seems to be much more openness to thinking that maybe these things are not as clear cut as they were. It's not as clear as it was a few years ago that training AI models is a fair use in the United States, or is one of the exceptions and limitations. And the EU AI Act, I think, is very interesting for European users to keep an eye on. We live in a very different copyright regime where there's a stronger moral rights in European intellectual property law, and it is very unclear whether these tools are respecting moral rights in the way that would satisfy the law. So I think that's something that librarians can do, talk about these things and be aware. I put a link in the document about there's a great website that tracks current litigation going on in the AI space. The other thing I would just to support a lot of what Javiera was saying, I think more education. I think I personally like to be very careful when I speak about these tools and never use verbs that I think where the subject of that verb is a human, has autonomy or agency. So for example, the people use the word hallucinate quite frequently about hallucinations for garbage outputs of these chatbots. I think that's bad because it implies that there is a mind that has a conception which is different from reality. There is no mind. These are just statistical models. I think, so I'm a little bit nervous about applications where we talk about, oh, we can enhance our creativity. I mean, a calculator could enhance your creativity if used in a creative way, but the human is the creative person, not the calculator. And even the word was to summarize. I'm sure Javiera was talking about summarizing things. I'm sure Javiera was looking at the output and with her insightful and knowledgeable thing was checking to make sure this is reasonable. Summary, to me, if you define the word summarize? It means read something and extract the most important ideas from it and state them succinctly. Something without a mind cannot do that. A statistical model cannot summarize something. It can collect the most frequently used word in a text, sure. And that might be useful in certain contexts, but I wish anyway, so I think that we can express with our colleagues these concerns, recommend tools that they can get the knowledge about what these tools actually can do and what they can't do. And we can stop using metaphors. Mahabeli has a really interesting article on metaphors for AI, which I think is beautiful and fun to read. And I think the whole approach is misguided. There is a thing that it really is. We don't need to use metaphors. It's not like a automated mansplainer or plagiarism at scale. It's not. None of these things are what it is. It is a statistical model. That's exactly what it is. It's trained on data and it spits out most probable token collections. We should teach people not to be afraid of that and not use metaphors, but use reality. Anyway.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have just the time for one last question from Marta. I see your comment. I see your hand raised.
Yeah, it was just an answer to Jonathan because, yeah, IP is one of the first things that I raise, and I don't think people understand that they are losing their own IP by entering stuff that they have created into the AI data set. So, but this is the one thing that everyone is shocked about, and also the one thing that nobody's clear about. So, and I don't think there is an easy answer to any of it. So, but I mean, it's good that librarians are being turned to us. Okay, so what do you think about IP and this? Which is,
I mean, there is a kind of obvious easy answer. Maybe it's too easy, but we in the scholarly world for hundreds, if not thousands of years, the primary scholarly value is you cite your sources, yes. Right? And until every damn thing that comes out of one of these models has a detailed, accurate list of the actual sources that were used to create that output, how does an academic use it ever? We're violating the fundamental sin of the academic world, right?
And it's actually a beautiful case study, and I know that some of my academic colleagues are actually doing this, that they are asking their students to ask something of AI and then ask it to create a set of references. And of course, about 75% of those references or more are invented. So, you know.
So thanks a lot for your strong perspective on the topic, Jonathan and Javiera. I'm very happy that we had this opportunity to discuss, and it's a pleasure to see librarians interacting with our guests so loudly with their perspective too. So I think that we will continue this conversation in time, because there's a lot to discover about where generative AI tools go and how we can continue with our role of educators, but at the same time being very careful about addressing this topic with all the care and attention that it requires for our learners, more at the broadest level possible. Javiera, please.
I just have a last kind of point that I would like to start talking with librarians, and how we can collaboratively work better in terms of how we're going to create a better infrastructure for OER at European level, for example. There is none. There is one that it's been in and out, let's say the OER world map, but still lacks quite a lot of interoperability and better data infrastructure. How are we going to start saving the OER that people has been doing, and saving, for example, LibGuides or blog posts, and how we're going to try to create a better digital ecosystem, open digital ecosystem for Europe. Of course, I use Zenodo quite a lot because it comes from CERN, it's quite reliable, it's quite stable, but it's not exactly fit for education. I think the next challenge for this community, and it's also students, academics, advocates, and librarians 100%, is how we're going to think about the next infrastructure level, where OER will sit, and how we will be able as a community to assess whether they are fit for purpose, and how we, for example, can better translate it, how we're going to enhance their interoperability, how we're going to enhance the metadata, which is quite scarce these days, how we're going to collaborate. I think this is kind of the next point. It's not just what's going to happen with AI, it's how we're going to better generate an infrastructure that serves us all in Europe, and also like the self-excluded ones from England, which I hope we will revert at some point. But how we're going to have a better infrastructure to collaborate, and where we can actually make the best of open education and open science and citizen science and open data in learning and teaching context. How we're going to facilitate a conversation in open solutions for the wider higher education sector in Europe, instead of keep trying to pick up with the latest technology, because today is AI, tomorrow is digital twins. Digital twins agenda is coming, it's dangerous. We don't exactly know how it really works. But that's going to be the next heat of the summer. And we know that the heat of the summer are drill your brain during times in which you actually need to relax. So I think this is kind of the next conversation that we need to have. What's going to happen with our own open digital infrastructures that actually meet their requirement of digital public goods, because it's actually something that needs to serve the entire community of learners and educators and librarians.
I like this perspective a lot, because it's looking at the technology and tools at the service of human beings, and not the other way around. We are not instrumental for the development of technologies; it's the other way around. And I love to look at this perspective. Also, the focus that you put into metadata, and find a place where OER can really be OER, meaning alive, meaning repurposable, meaning continuously changeable, not only downloadable. like it happens in many of the platforms that we have nowadays. So thanks a lot to the two of you and for this wonderful deep dive into the critical perspectives around the use of tools and around the role that we can have and that we should play continuously as open education practitioners.